I'm Patrick Watson. I'm an astrologer, and you're watching the fourth official episode of BigFatAstroChat. And today I have with me the human ephemeris, Nick Dagan Best, my mentor and astrological father, in a sense. So, welcome to the show, Nick.
The Darth Vader to your Luke Skywalker, is that what we're shooting for?
Yeah, I suppose if you're a Sith Lord.
Once upon a time, yeah, you're right. Yeah, well, you are almost the age I was when you and I met. You're closing
30.
in on that, so yeah. No, I was older than that, but yeah,
You were 30 when you started studying astrology, right?
No, I was 26.
26. Okay, I thought it was. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it wasn't quite a Saturn return. I was 26, but when I met you, I was 36. So yes, I once was a guy in my 30s talking to teenagers on the internet about astrology. So,
and we're still going at it.
Yes, and I'm very proud. But
oh, thank you.
Yeah. Well,
So I was just trying to figure out a way to introduce you. Like, you know, people should know who you are, if they don't already. But basically, I guess, like, you get this nickname, the human ephemeris, because you have this uncanny ability to recall the general positions of planets for any given date, and you do that through kind of your memorization of different cycles, being able to kind of count backward and forward, and just having a general awareness of how it kind of fits together in a way that most astrologers find fairly impressive and remarkable. So that's kind of your special ability. What else?
Well, yeah. Well, mostly I'm a calendar freak. I was one of those people who always remembers calendar dates, and it's something that runs in my family. My brother has it, my birth father had it, my maternal grandmother had it. So it comes to me from two genetic streams, as it were. So it's just we're all history buffs in my family, and I in particular have always paid close attention to chronology. That's what it comes down to. And that's basically when I got interested in astrology. It was mainly because it's this amazing calendar system. No matter what you think of astrology, no matter what your opinion, it is that, along with all the other things it can be.
Right.
And that's always been the main sort of fascination for me with regard to astrology. Although obviously I've been studying the subject for many years, and I'm interested in a lot of different streams of ideas that come out of it.
Right. So that's super cool. So today I had Nick on the show today because recently I've been thinking a lot about what planet kind of represents someone overall in a sense. And so usually, you know, when you're first starting with astrology, that's like your sun. The sun is supposed to kind of be a general descriptor, but as you begin to learn more about astrology, you learn about, you know, the fact that you have a moon sign, and that all of the planets were in signs at the time you were born. Pardon me. And the ruler of the ascendant is supposed to be another planet in your chart that kind of gives you an overall description. So I've been trying to figure that out, and in the course of figuring that out, I sort of wanted to see how generally agreed upon personalities are reflected in the ascendant ruler. So I realized that, you know, we have the birth times for all the Beatles, and we kind of have a general idea of like their personas, you know, as they were in a group. You know, they each kind of had like distinct personalities in a sense. So I thought it was really interesting looking at the ascendant rulers of each of the Beatles and seeing kind of how it gives an overall description which seems to match up with, you know, what we do know them for, and what they be most known for in some general sense. And not only that, but I also through the timeless system of annual perfections, you can kind of tell what specific years in which they would embody the quality or character of that ascendant ruler when it kind of comes into focus. And so I wanted to bring on Nick because Nick is he's has a fantastic database of literally thousands of charts of celebrities and biographies, chronologies, and he has a fantastic file on the Beatles. And so I was able to draw on that for some of my research and how what kinds of transits were affecting them when. And so he's got a fantastic knowledge of this time period and the characters. And so, this is like the guy to go to, to ask about astrology of the Beatles. Like, this is like, definitely a part of your wheelhouse, I would say. You studied this quite a lot then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
So excellent.
It's fun. I've been studying it for so long too, that it's fun to actually get to have this conversation with someone, because it's
now
usually just something I keep to myself.
My knowledge of the Beatles comes from being a fan. That's how I learned to play the piano, was just I knew how the songs were supposed to sound because I loved the songs so much. Just listening to them in the car. My mom is a huge Beatles fan. The reason why my mom decided to marry an English musician is because she was in love with Paul McCartney since she was a girl. So I partly exist because of the Beatles. So so yeah, that's part of where my knowledge about things comes from. And then obviously, later on, as I kind of started getting more interested in learning about chronologies of musicians and other figures, through this astrological lens, this is kind of when, those interests kind of coincided for me. But I couldn't claim to be so much of an expert at the all of the ins and outs. And so, yeah, I think together we're going to perhaps come to some interesting, because I've been approaching it from this like rulership and annual perfection type lens, whereas you've been approaching it more from getting the overall general swath of the chronology and seeing how certain cycles seem to be recurring for each one. So why don't we wonder where to start? Should we start with like John?
Sure. Well, I thought I would just just as my own little preamble.
Yes.
I got into the Beatles at a very young age. I was born in 1968. I was born literally as they were recording the White Album. In fact, I was born pretty much the same moment that they were recording Your Blues on the White Album, which is like, of all the beautiful, positive Beatles songs, of course, I was born during the most, depressing and literally suicidal Beatles song. So anyway, I don't know what that's supposed to say, but I saw Yellow Submarine. First of all, I had a very hippie upbringing. My parents lived in a house full of hippies, so naturally there were a lot of Beatle records around. And I saw Yellow Submarine preschool age. And by the time I was getting into grade school, I'd had my dad take me to see all the Beatles movies at a local sort of repertory cinema. So I'd seen all 5 of the Beatles movies easily before I was 7, maybe even before I was 6. Wow. And had a lot of the records. And it's funny, there's a total connection between that fandom and becoming the quote unquote human ephemeris, because at a very early age, the great thing about the Beatles, even 4-year-old me could look at all these Beatle album covers and see those movies and understand that when they started, they all had short hair and they all wore these suits, and that they gradually started to change, and that the hair gradually grew longer, and that the more time passed, they, then they had the beards and the long hair, and then they broke up. And it's hard to convey, but when you're a 4-year-old, and looking at this, what I was understanding was a sort of a thread of time, a chronology. I didn't just see them as these abstract guys, like, Bugs Bunny always looks like Bugs Bunny, and there's no Bugs Bunny cartoon that takes place before or after any other. You know what I mean? There's no sequence to it.
How does a mop-top skiffle rock band become a long-haired, innovative studio band.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that whole sort of story. So I understood it as a story. I understood it as a chronology, and that sort of as I grew older, I was music obsessed like a lot of young people, but I was always very aware of like whatever artist I was interested in, what their chronological story was.
So I'm curious because I guess just to give a brief rundown of kind of how I see
Yeah.
the chronologies breaking down for each one of the Beatles, and then it'd be really interesting to hear what you have to say about how you would identify which planetary cycles potentially you'd identify as being relevant for each Beatle, as well as the Beatles as a whole, and kind of the planetary cycle that kind of describes that change.
Mm.
So for John, and I'll see if I
Yeah.
can throw up an image here,
Mm-hmm.
so we can kind of get a bit of context here. Some of what I'm looking at. Okay, John Lennon. Whoops. Beatles. There we go. So let me just get the others up here. So while I'm talking, so with John Lennon, he was born with Aries rising, correct?
Yeah, it's a good bet. I think the thing about the Beatles' birth times is they all come to us from family legend, and so they're not written in stone. But the Aries rising chart is the one we generally get for John Lennon, and certainly a study of the transits bears it out. And I think his personality, if you're gonna go that route with the ascendant, he might have been a Libra, but he was no. He had a real razor edge to him, and certainly when he was young, he was quite a tough guy. So
yeah, and that's kind of what surprised me too. Is we think of John Lennon immediately as being kind of this peace activist. We know he's a Sun in Libra, so we automatically kind of go, oh,
right.
like there's connotations of peace and the music and everything. The peaceful anthem. Imagine, but really, with Aries rising, that sort of means Mars is the planet that represents him in an overall sense. And,
Yeah.
and it's funny to see how many ways in which he actually really more properly embodies Mars more than like Venus or the Sun in Libra, because he was known for being, well, one, Mars is in the seventh, and that's supposed to be like, potentially aggressive toward partners or troubles on account of one's partner. And that's sort of the conventional interpretation you might have for that position. And we do know that, he was, he, sorry, I'm trying to get Ringo Starr's time up here before we, all right, here we go. We know that. Okay, so here we go. Here's John Lennon's birth chart. I'm gonna see if I can share this. Share screen. View chart. So, do you see that?
I see you've started sharing the screen. Yep, I see it.
Okay, so yeah, this is John Lennon's chart. So because he was born with Aries rising, this is why we sort of look at Mars. And so he has Mars in the seventh. Conventional interpretation of Mars in the seventh is, one who gets into trouble or has troubles on account of their spouse or partner. And so, his relationship with Yoko Ono, has been controversial over the years. She was blamed for, being the person who broke up the band, which wasn't necessarily true, but it was coincidence.
I don't think it was true at all. No.
I mean,
it was more,
it really was John himself.
Yeah, it was. I think it was the death of Brian Epstein, really, and it just sort of took a few years to crumble after that. But that's the real. That's I mean, Lennon himself said really after that happened, he thought they were done for, and they did their best, but that's where you see them really become individuals, and so much so that it was a matter of time before
So yeah,
they're fighting over management.
Yes, right. The other thing is, John Lennon, he did admit later on in his life that he was abusive to both both of his wives, and
Yeah.
that is kind of another. I mean, it's one of those things you wouldn't say about someone if they have Mars in the seventh. You know, you must be a wife beater, but like,
Right.
you know, it was true in John Lennon's case.
Yeah, well, I think he was, he was, that's certainly true. And, it's not something he hid from anyone at the end of the day. The further he went on in his post-Beatle years, the more he spoke openly about his foibles. I mean, he'd always had some
Right.
degree of transparency for someone that visible. But yeah, it's not, it's true. And we can say it's true because he was he was ultimately one to admit it, as I think before, Yoko or Cynthia were ever compelled to talk about it.
Right.
So yeah, there is that component to him. And certainly, you're right insofar, like, I mean, both those marriages had their own share of controversy at the time, because I mean, he married his first wife, Cynthia, really because she was pregnant, and it
Right.
was, considered the thing to do.
He often
And
broke he was often outside of the bounds of his marriage.
Well, there was that as well, because he was, he was one of the most chased after men of the decade. And during a decade, I might add, when a lot of people were having a lot of sex.
Right.
So that was, and I think your main point about Yoko is right. I mean, even if she didn't break up the Beatles, it was always said that she was, and that's
Right.
enough of a sort of Mars in the seventh.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't need to be. It doesn't
Right.
need to be true, because sometimes when people say something a lot, and that was a total, and I think remains. It's kind of a punchline. Like if memes had existed in those days, it would totally be a meme.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, point well taken.
Right.
I might add,
Yeah.
in defense of the Aries rising, John Lennon, when Saturn was conjunct that ascendant in Aries in October 1968, just as the Beatles were getting ready to release the White Album, they were mixing it at the time. Saturn was on his ascendant, and he was arrested for drug possession in London. Which really had huge consequences for him, because later on, when he was in New York, the whole reason that he was almost, deported from the country by the Nixon administration, because Lennon was involved in all this, political activism that in the age of Nixon put him on the enemies list. And
Right.
it's the bust of October 1968, when Saturn's on his ascendant, that causes all this fuss that really haunts him for the next 8 years. And furthermore, Yoko Ono was pregnant at the time of this drug bust, and it was the anxiety and the stress from this arrest that caused her, some would say anyway, certainly Lennon blamed it on the bust, on this arrest, on the stress of it. So it also wound up being, I mean, in between sort of the drug bust, the general drug use, because during this period, John was involved in the hardest drugs of his life. And losing a child, getting arrested, all these complications, and the breakup of the Beatles. When you see the movie Let It Be, that's about 2-3 months. That was January 1969. So just, 2.5 months after the arrest. And you can see, Let It Be is a notoriously sort of a movie where they're all sort of breaking up on camera, and that's the kind of shape he's in when Saturn's on his ascendant at that time.
You're saying in defense of that, so you're basically saying like that's an event you consider to be really basically more or less proving that like that really is his ascending degree, because Saturn was there.
That's exactly what I'm saying, because that's a really good arbiter, a Saturn transit across the ascendant. And furthermore, let me give you one more on that theme. John Lennon isn't even the only Beatle to be seriously arrested, have a serious drug arrest while Saturn was crossing his ascendant, with Paul McCartney. If you want to put Paul McCartney's chart up.
Sure.
The most popular version of this chart has a Virgo rising. Now, there is apparently some other source that offers an AM/PM issue, and that maybe he's got a Pisces rising. But I've got a very solid defense for the Virgo rising chart. And that's basically the fact that Saturn was crossing Paul's Virgo ascendant when he was arrested for marijuana possession in Japan in January 1980. And this was also serious because he's in a foreign country, and
Yeah.
you know, really, if he hadn't been this really, really famous celebrity, he would have been in serious trouble.
Right. Um,
And for quite a long time, he wasn't allowed back in that country. Eventually, it was, you know, he was. I think he's been back since, but it took a long time. It took several decades before he was ever allowed
so
back in
with
Japan.
With Paul McCartney's chart, you know, what I thought was so impressive about his chart is the fact that, you know, with Virgo rising, that makes
Mm-hmm.
Mercury the ruler of
Yes.
his ascendant, and he has Mercury in the 10th whole sign house, the house of like career and
Yes.
reputation, and it's in its own sign of Gemini, which is a positive for Mercury, means Mercury can operate its most sort of natural. It is
Yeah.
retrograde, but it's, I mean, it's still, you know, in a very prominent place in the chart and in its best sign, and you know, known Mercury is associated with you know, I guess cleverness, invention, not being able to be pinned down, being multi variant, multi talented. And
Yes. Yeah.
so what I think is really interesting,
Paul's a
that basically describes Paul to me.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. I'm very, very, very much. Some people don't know, you know, that awesome guitar solo on Taxman?
mhm.
That's not George, that's Paul.
Paul.
And yeah, Paul plays that guitar solo, that whole guitar, which is one of the best guitar solos on any Beatles album, in my opinion.
Mercury is manual dexterity and rhythm as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So
But Paul, you
yeah,
know, Paul also plays the drums on Back in the USSR and Glass Onion. Yeah, yeah.
he could play all of the instruments. Well,
Or
didn't
Dear Prudence. Sorry.
he
Yeah. So he's
later on in his solo career he would record all the instruments himself on
sure. Yeah, he made
you
a
know, his
few
albums. So
albums like that. You know?
yeah, so he yeah, I mean, very much so, the multi instrumentalist, the multi.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting about that with Mercury retrograde as well is, you know, because he's left-handed, he had to learn bass backwards, which I think is
Yeah.
a fun
Yeah.
distillation of Mercury retrograde. You know, the fact that he's still so good at it, but kind of, you know, Mercury is a very independent kind of planet. You know, doesn't like to be sort of
Yeah.
pinned down. So I think that's really interesting because when you look at the whole swath of his career, he, you know, he really has dabbled in like everything. I mean, you know, people know him for, you know, Yesterday and Blackbird and Let It Be and all
Hmm.
those classics, Hey Jude. But I mean, people kind of forget, like, he's like done a lot of classical music, you know, in the 90s.
Yeah.
He's done
Oh
like
yeah, yeah.
symphonic
He's
work,
full
and
symphonic things. Yeah.
but then he's done like, you know, these sort of kind of avant-garde electronic music. You know, I mean, in some ways he kind of actually outstripped John Lennon in that.
Oh, he totally did. He was doing that avant-garde electronic music years before John Lennon did Revolution 9 on the White
Right.
Album, and that's one of the uh, you know, myths about Paul McCartney, that he's this sort of one-dimensional, you know, silly love
I mean,
song
it's
guy.
completely untrue. Like, it's
No, see that you got to know their stories. Basically, when the Beatles became famous, you know, in '63, basically in England, and then the next year in America, but even just in England in '63, they moved from Liverpool to London. But they were touring so much and they were so busy that they didn't even really buy their own houses. What happened was their manager, Brian Epstein, he had a business manager, like an accountant, who literally went out and bought houses for the Beatles so that they would have somewhere to live when they were briefly home, and, you know, so John's wife could raise his baby and so on and so forth. And the only Beatle who didn't get a house was Paul, because he was living with his girlfriend's family in downtown London. Whereas John, George, and Ringo, their houses were bought by their accountant, who literally bought them houses in a neighborhood in way suburban areas outside of London where accountants generally lived. And the reason this is important is because Paul lived in London, he was going to art galleries. He was listening. He was going to the symphony. He was being exposed to like the avant-garde ideas. He was going to the, you know, the avant-garde little bookstore that John met Yoko in 1966. Well, Paul helped set that store up. He was friends with those guys before any of the Beatles. So he was really the cutting edge guy, and very much in a Gemini way. This is another thing that sort of justifies that really powerful Mercury in him, because he was just so involved in all these things. But what happens is, at the same time, John's got a wife and child, and he's stuck out in the suburbs. And so when you get to 1968, both of them really just kind of snap, and they really envy each other's lives. And if you notice, by the time the Beatles break up, what's Paul doing? Well, he's got a wife and an adopted child with a kid on the way, and they're living way out in Scotland, like beyond the suburbs. He's totally taking the life John had for most of the Beatle years that he envied. And what does John do? John moves into it's an apartment in downtown London. I've seen it because it was a flat that was owned by Ringo. Jimi Hendrix had been the previous tenant, and John lived there with Yoko, and that was the place they were busted in 1968. Right. And so that's when John is like being, you know, suddenly he's the London, you know, urban guy, avant-garde. He's doing all the stuff that he envied in Paul. And I think that's like there's a whole psychology to the Beatles and how they evolved that's as interesting as the story itself.
Totally. And what do you make of Neptune rising for Paul?
Yeah, well, that's a critical thing, actually. I'm glad you gave me that as a segue. In some ways, you can look at the entire story of the Beatles from beginning to end by looking at the transit of Neptune through Scorpio. And I'll explain why.
Yeah.
Because if you go back to 1956, October of 1956, this is when Paul's mother, Mary, dies of breast cancer. She dies, October 31st, 1956. And it's literally, as I recall, I'm looking here. Yeah, it's the
Feel
day
free to share your
Neptune
screen if you have the chart.
Okay, yeah. It's here in the file. I'm going to put the chart up, and then I'll share the screen. Okay, here we are. Okay, I don't know what time she died, so I'm just going to quickly get rid of the angles on the chart so they don't confuse people, because that can happen. Okay, and I don't need house lines.
Where we're going, we don't need house lines.
Well, if we don't have, if we're not using angles, if we don't have a time, then there's no point. I just use the house lines here. All right, the angle lines we don't need. Yeah. All right, so here we go. Neptune on October 31st, 1956, Mary McCartney died of breast cancer. And Neptune had literally just gone into Scorpio. Now, it's going to be another, here, I'll put the database up on this side. So that's 1956, and it'll be a few months later, on July 6th, that John Lennon's going to meet Paul McCartney. So when Paul met John, his mother had been dead for, 9 months, something like that. And they meet, and eventually they start playing music together. You can see Neptune had regressed back to Libra, but it's by the time they start playing music, Paul joins the Quarrymen not long after. And, Neptune goes, by the time he plays, his live debut is here, October. And by that point, Neptune's gone back into Scorpio.
So you'd say that, like Neptune into Scorpio, so Neptune was relevant for the Beatles and seemed to center around Paul because of the, he was born with Neptune rising. So he's kind of tied in with Neptune then through his life?
Well, because here's the thing, another one of these background psychological stories of the Beatles has to do with dead mothers, because, so Paul's mother dies in October of 56. He meets John in July of 57. John's mother dies in July of 58. She's hit by a car.
Right.
And that is the bonding thing. The two of them are already playing informally with George Harrison, who joined in early 58. But this is what really bonds John and Paul and turns them into the songwriting team. Now, George's mother is this amazing Leo woman named Louise Harrison, who's the opposite. You know, you always hear about like the other Beatle parents, whether it's John's Aunt Mimi or Paul's dad. They're not really into their kids being, you know, playing music or hanging out with each other. They think it's
George's
mom
mom.
and all this.
George's mom is
George's
the one
mom
who
is the
encouraged them, right?
She encouraged them. She let them practice in her house. You know, when the Beatles became famous, she was known to be like really like extra friendly with the fans and would answer fan mail, like really, and a real Leo mom. And she died in May 1970, just as the Beatles are breaking up, and that's just as George. Well, yeah, this is where I'm going with this. That's when George really eclipses John and Paul right as the Beatles break up, because his solo album is by far the most successful out of any of theirs out of the gate, which was kind of the important. Again, there's a psychology to this because they're always very competitive with each other, and George is sort of the little brother whose mother was alive when John and Paul were bonding over their mother's being dead.
This would be a good time to start.
Literally, just one last thing, the first ingress or the Neptune going into Sagittarius occurs right at the beginning of 1970, literally as George, Paul, and Ringo meet up to do their last recording sessions ever, you know, basically in the Beatle era, to do a couple of last recordings for the Let It Be movie, which would come out in April. By that point, they'd broken up. But really, so from the death of Paul's mother to all of them meeting each other to the very last recording session, that's sort of perfectly bookended to the day of Neptune and Scorpio.
Wow, that is awesome. I was just going to say that this might be a good time to look at George Harrison's chart, because when Neptune ingressed into Scorpio, that has an interesting connection with George Harrison's chart. I have the chart right here for George Harrison.
Why don't you put him up?
Yeah, I'll put him up. So here is George Harrison's chart. So we were just talking about how Neptune was at 0 Scorpio basically when the Beatles kind of first met up. And then if we take a look at George Harrison's chart, we can see that he was born with the moon at 0 degrees Scorpio and, you know, ascended in early Scorpio. So Neptune at that time was on his ascendant, basically a mirror of Paul McCartney's chart. You know, experience that Neptune conjunction as, you know, he becomes a part of the Beatles. And so I thought that was kind of a cool connection I made just now when you mentioned the Neptune Scorpio transit.
No, absolutely. George's chart is interesting for a number of reasons. He was always my favorite Beatle, by the way. But that Scorpio moon with the Scorpio ascendant, he does indeed. It's literally like, you know, the whole, as I just explained, the Beatle years really are encompassed by Neptune and Scorpio, and it's almost to the day of Neptune leaving Scorpio. Suddenly, George becomes visible as an individual. When he really. You know, obviously the fans always knew who he was, but he was, you know, John and Paul were the successful songwriters. And then Ringo was the star of the movies anyway, and sort of a mascot, you know, of sorts.
Jokey one.
Yeah, because even people who weren't into the Beatles knew Ringo's name, you know, it was kind of that, even like whoever, you know, Johnny Carson or people who were older and square and not into the youth culture at the time, they would know who Ringo is. If someone said Ringo, they'd know, that's one of those British noise
tops.
So, they're all kind of, of the four of them. And people used to say about George as a singer that his voice was sort of the invisible voice, because the Beatles were, you know, John, Paul, and George were a phenomenal harmony singing team.
Right.
If they'd never had any instrumental or songwriting talent, just as singers, they would be, you know, beyond exceptional, I think, as a singing unit. If all they had ever done was just sort of.
But George was always the secret sauce.
They were phenomenal.
Like George was always like, I felt like the secret weapon of the Beatles.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I mean, like, and you know, he had to really prove himself, and I think that's really interesting. You mentioned that about the moon and with his chart, because that's kind of the main thing that I noticed about his chart through this like analysis of the ruler of the ascendant. Because, you know, we take a look at the moon, you know, right on his ascendant, and the moon rules the 9th house in his chart, the house of like spirituality, religion, but also the house of foreign places. And so I think it's really interesting because with the ruler of the ninth importing its significations to his ascendant, you know, he's the one who brought the sound of Indian music to the group. You know, he's the one who kind of eventually gained this kind of sort of mystical, spiritual kind of persona. You know, he was the one who brought them into you know, the contact with you know, the what's his name, the yoga,
The
the
Maharishi.
Maharishi.
The
Yeah,
Maharishi.
he was the one who kind of brought them to that. So I thought it was really interesting.
And Paul and Ringo to this day still swear by the meditation that they learned in that sojourn. So he's had a really lasting impact on their lives in that way by getting them into that.
Yeah, so I thought that was just, I mean, so like it's funny because while he is more like Mars in Capricorn in the third, which I'll kind of explain in just a second, I thought it's just so amazing that, you know, out of all of the different things that he could also bring, you know, to the table, you know, he brings what the moon represents in his chart, which is, you know, this
and of course, again, he had a really strong mother, this powerful matriarch who helped sustain the Beatles as much as any grown up was doing at the time.
Absolutely. So with Mars in Capricorn, I feel like I see the Mars in Capricorn thing. I mean, the third is brothers, and I think in the context of his life, I think, you know, more than representing siblings, I think it represents his brothers, the Beatles, and his competition, his competitive nature with John and Paul, having to prove himself, you know, having to kind of overcome like the overpowering nature of their songwriting contributions, and really having to you know, kind of fight for his place, you know, amongst his brothers. And
well, I think the other, George was literally, even in his own family, the baby of a family of, I think, 5 or so kids with 3 older brothers. So he was always the favorite. He's like, even outside of the Beatles, brothers is a huge theme for him because he had these 3 much older brothers. I think it was 3 older brothers, definitely more than 2. And he was way younger than them. Like they were already, I think, almost teenagers when he was born or whatever. So that brothers thing works into his chart just in terms of him being an everyday person.
Interesting. Another thing that's interesting about the third house is the third house is supposed to be the house of short trips, which is always kind of a strange thing to apply to someone's life. Like, how does that make sense? But he was really into Formula One racing. You know, he loved like this risky, you know, like racing too. He even wrote that song Faster. You know, it's all about racing cars. It's just, what's odd about that is it's something that's so kind of oddly specific, and it's something that you could say about Mars in the third house, like someone who potentially likes to, you know, be risky or dangerous, you know, or bold with regard to short trips. I mean, there's such a, you know, astrology's way of putting it. But that was true. That is true for him. He you know, he owned Formula One cars, and he liked to race laps around lanes at his house, and
somewhere there's an interview. I think it's either with Eric Idle or Michael Palin of Monty Python, where they just talk about the way he drove, not on a racetrack, like, you know, in real life. In fact, I believe it's coming back to me. I think even in the database, I've got chart files of him getting speeding tickets. Like he got some pretty serious speeding tickets, and maybe even an arrest or 2 over speeding. Like he was kind of a crazy driver, just generally. I think the racetrack was like where he wound up because he was generally a crazy driver. I was actually noticing Paul McCartney also had his license suspended for a year when he was 21. Like in the middle of the Beatlemania years, he had his license suspended because he was also a bit of a speed freak with the car. You know, 21-year-old guy with what was probably like the flyest car of 1963.
Right. So with Mars and Capricorn, though, you know, Capricorn is like the exaltation of Mars. It's supposed to be like one of the most like respected you know, Mars positions out there. And so I think it's interesting because he basically I mean, he what, you know, on the few songs that he has written for the Beatles, those are like among like the most successful. I mean, some of his songs are some of the most iconic, you know, like you know, Here Comes the Sun, Something,
Hmm.
you know, is basically like a standard classic, you know. I mean, he
Yeah.
really, and he came out with those songs um while he was actually in a Capricorn annual perfection. Like that's when he
Oh
you know
yeah.
kind of made those he and I think the interesting thing to point out about how that's like Mars is what I thought was interesting, like when you kind of look at the Beatles. I mean, we have John Lennon, who has an ascendant ruled by Mars, and we have George Harrison, who has an ascendant ruled by Mars, whereas
Yes.
Paul has his ascendant ruled by Mercury and Ringo's Jupiter. So what I
Yes.
think is interesting is that George Harrison and John Lennon seem to both define themselves by the separation from the Beatles. Like in order to kind of progress with their regular identities,
Absolutely.
they had to kind of, they almost had to divorce themselves. You know, John Lennon sang, "I don't believe in the Beatles," and you know, George Harrison kind of he defined himself almost by his separation from the Beatles, and he's saying like,
Yes.
"This is who I am."
Yeah.
Whereas Ringo, you know, holds on to, you know, the old flame, you know. Ringo and Paul never forced, he never felt like he had to divorce, you know, himself from the Beatles. That
Yes.
was, he sort of celebrated that as part of his, um, you know, his identity. He didn't feel like he had to kind of say like, no, I'm not that anymore. Like he kind of basked in the glow of it. So I thought it was interesting that, but the two Mars ruled members, they're the ones that kind of said like, you know, I'm not that. That's how they kind of define themselves. Would you
Oh,
agree
I'd
with that?
fully agree. I'd fully agree. And they were both quicker to rebel against the Beatle thing while being in the Beatles. What's interesting about George is when you think about it, he's the only Beatle who had Saturn transiting Saturn conjunct his sun during the Beatle years. Saturn went into Pisces in 1964, really as the Beatlemania thing was reveling in the touring, which really got to George more than anyone. George is the one who instigated them stopping touring, which is interesting for a guy with Mars in the third. But
Right.
say it was his Saturn and Pisces years. He hated it the most. You know, he was the one who was the least, after the Beatle years, you know, passed. He was the one who was the least sentimental about it all.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, you always see in those interviews, and that's like, you know, the way one often looks back in the years when Saturn was conjunct their sun.
Yeah.
Um, you know, um,
Wasn't the best time
so
for him, actually. Yeah.
yeah, no, it wasn't. And so, you know, that's something to keep in mind there. The other thing, if I can, I wanted to point out not just the Mars, but that Mercury of his. Can I share the
Oh,
screen for a
of
sec? I
course.
wanted
Yeah.
to
Go
show
ahead.
you
Go
some
right ahead.
charts. Okay, I'm going to do that. Um, you know, I do a lot of cyclical stuff with astrology, the synodic cycles of Venus and Mars in particular. So here's a couple of things to consider. This is a chart for the very first gig George played with the Quarrymen in March of 1958. And you can see this Venus here was just coming out of its retrograde phase, and it's at 9 degrees Aquarius, which is, of course, I'll pull up his natal chart.
Oh, I just wanted to, I
Um,
just was
you see where
reminded
I'm
that,
going with that?
yeah, I was just reminded that he was actually he was in a Mars, like Capricorn third house annual perfection when he joined the Beatles. Just
Oh,
before his
okay.
birthday, that was hit during his Capricorn perfection. And then the next one was the year that they broke up. So obviously Mars in the third, the
Right, right. Oh,
brothers.
perfect.
And then the 12 years after that, in the next Capricorn perfection, he uh what happened in that one?
Oh, he released all those years ago. He released the album,
Oh yeah, all
the
those
single
years
about
ago,
John
yeah,
Lennon.
to remember to yeah, commemorate with John Lennon. And that was the next time that he actually kind of met up back with like those guys. And then
Yeah.
the 12 years after that was when he did interviews for the Beatles anthology. So it was like the next time that he got together with
Mm.
that band of brothers again. And it's actually funny to remember to note that um he was actually the one who well, one, he caused a few problems throughout the process because it was the anthology was really it was originally supposed to be called The Long and Winding Road, but George Harrison was like, I don't want the entire Beatles history to be summed up by a Paul song. So
Right.
like, he was still fighting for, his place. And he was also the one who kind of ended the anthology. They were originally going to do, they did Real Love second, and they did the
Yes.
Free as a Bird as the first song.
Yes.
Was like the first post Beatles.
Right. And those were pretty good. I mean,
those are great. I love
considering
them.
the circumstances.
He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do another one though. He was like, I hope people make hit songs out of my crappy demos. He was kind of unsentimental about it. And it's just like what you said.
Right.
It reminds you of that Mars in third. But yeah, so those were kind of those key points kind of came at those Capricorn perfection years when he had Mars activated as the Time Lord. But anyway, sorry, didn't mean to.
That's a great sort of example of how that technique works. I was just going to point out, for some reason, this Mercury in Aquarius gets hit by a lot of really interesting transits. Number one, the Venus retrograde cycle. So in 1958, this is Venus just coming out of its retrograde, and it's conjunct that Mercury of his. And this is the first time he plays with the Beatles, which obviously is an important day in his life, no matter where his sentimentality thereof went after the fact. 8 years after that, he marries his wife, Pattie Boyd, the woman who inspired the song Something. And then later, Eric Clapton wrote Layla about her, but that's a whole other story. He married her during the same Venus retrograde.
It's another big Mars thing for him, with his friends.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I forgot to mention that. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Husbands-in-law. Yeah. Husbands-in-law. So you can see like that sort of that Venus cycle, him getting together with the Beatles, him getting together with Pattie Boyd, these really fateful relationships for him. Actually, it's interesting. Out of the Beatles, with regard to the Venus retrograde cycle, George married Pattie Boyd during this Venus retrograde. John married Yoko, and Paul married Linda in March of 1969 during the Venus retrograde in Aries. And then the only Beatle who didn't get married during the Venus retrograde is Ringo, but he was born with the natal Venus retrograde.
Venus retrograde, right.
Although actually Ringo is not the only Beatle born with the Venus retrograde per se, because Stu Sutcliffe was about 2 weeks older than Ringo. And that's actually an interesting thing about, maybe I'll pull their charts up so you can see them. Stu Sutcliffe, of course, is he's famous to Beatle fans because he was in the Beatles in the very early days before Ringo was in the Beatles. He was the bass player. Mm-hmm. He was a friend of John's. He was really more of a painter than a musician. And he ultimately stayed behind in Hamburg and died tragically. Here's Ringo, and there's Stu Sutcliffe here. Okay, so
Sutcliffe danced with Cynthia at a party when they were going out, and John was thrown into such a rage when he saw them dancing together that he slapped Cynthia against a wall, and she broke off their engagement. And that was also during a Mars in Libra perfection year.
Okay.
So that kind of literal.
Definitely Martian. Definitely Martian. Here's the thing. I have a theory. Stu Sutcliffe, there we go. He's a Cancer with the Venus retrograde in Cancer. He was born June 23rd, 1940. And then Ringo is born, basically 2 weeks later with the Venus retrograde in Gemini. And the thing about that struck me about Stu Sutcliffe and Ringo Starr is how they shape. They're the two guys in the Beatles who shape the Beatles image, and I'll explain. Stu Sutcliffe, like when the Beatles first started, they were sort of leather teddy boys. They wore leather jackets. They had sort of 50s slick back hair, like you kind of sporting today. See, you're wearing the 1950s Beatles hair. I'm wearing the 1960s Beatles. But then they go to Hamburg, and Stu starts dating this German woman, Astrid Kircher, and she combs his hair forward, with these bangs, and she starts taking these very artful pictures of him, black and white photos with a lot of like shadows where like half the face is covered in shadow and what have you. And at first the Beatles laugh at Stu's haircut, but eventually they all adopt it. And this is a haircut that is going to make them famous. That's going to define them more than anything. Before their music, it's just the fact that the four of them all have these haircuts, and it's such a great gimmick for that period. And Stu Sutcliffe is really the originator of that. And Astrid Kircher had a lot to do with the way the Beatles were presented artistically. Like later album covers imitated that shadowy photographic look and all that, the somber black and white thing. So that's like what Stu Sutcliffe gave the Beatles. And then Ringo, like I was saying before, Ringo was sort of like, if you look at the Beatle movies, Ringo was actually the front man. Like if the Beatles, it's kind of a weird thing because he's not the lead
leader
singer
of the band, but
he's not the leader of the band.
He got all the choice one-liners. He got all the,
exactly. Like I mean, the first Beatles movie, Hard Day's Night. I mean, all the guys in the band are featured, but he's the one who sort of goes off. Like there's a scene in the movie, if you've seen it, where he
I've seen them.
Kind of runs out on the band and he goes for this long, ponderous walk and meets a kid and all this stuff. Like he's the one who gets his own little. A special scene, and then of course in Help, the next movie, the whole plot revolves around him having a ring that belongs to this
oh my gosh. In
Yellow Submarine, he's a bit more of a central character. Certainly he's portrayed in the kid friendly fashion. So there's this thing about those movies, and those movies had a really important impact at the time, I think, in terms of how the band was seen. And there was something about Ringo, like I said, he was, because of the way he looked, I think he gave them that sort of cuddly appearance that made them palpable and acceptable to middle America in that 60s. Yeah. As much as they were revolutionary and all this, they were just safe enough. And I think Ringo gave them that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Homegrown country boy, not country boy, but
like kind of, he's this harmless guy. The lads, he made them seem less sort of threatening because really George, Paul, and John on their own like without him, they're a force, but he kind of made it look all.
He made it look pleasant. And that's a fantastic point because he has Jupiter ruling his ascendant, in the third house, and the third house again. I think with brothers, he didn't have any siblings, so really,
no.
I mean we'd say about the rule of the ascendant that whatever house it kind of falls in provides a special focus for the natives. So obviously his sibling relationships, his relationships with his brothers, the Beatles, is a major, theme in his life. I think one of the most just amazing confluences of like transits and techniques that I found with annual perfections, I found with Ringo Starr's chart. I'm gonna, if I could share my screen just for a second.
Yeah, there we go.
So what I think is amazing, what I think is just like a truly like amazing demonstration of this technique of looking at the ascendant ruler and looking at like when it's an annually perfected planet. So with Ringo Starr, we had this Jupiter in the third thing, and he is in a third house perfection in 1954, which is the year that he said that he discovered the drums, but we don't have an exact date for that. But it's interesting because the next time he experiences a third house perfection is at age 26, and that is when I'm going to share my screen now. Where is that? Okay, I'll go. Let me make sure I can actually share this. Oh, whoops. Where is it? Oh. Okay, here we go. Got it. View by wheel. There we go. Got it. All right, let me share this now. This should be it. Okay. So these are the transits for when he did the recording for With a Little Help from My Friends.
Okay.
And so he was in a Taurus annual perfection year, and so we'd say that Venus is the most important planet that year, and that Taurus is the most important sign that year. And so not only is his, so Venus transited into Taurus and hit the degree of his Jupiter. And now the funny story about Little Help from My Friends, and actually I got this from your notes, and then I was able to confirm with the sources, but the story behind that is the song With a Little Help from My Friends was written by Paul and John. They wrote it specifically for Ringo because it was like the tradition that he had one song per album. Yes. And they on the day of, they did all of the instrumental backing tracks first, and they were going on and on into the night recording them, and so they finally got around to like the vocals like around dawn. And Ringo was so tired that he, just wanted to leave and go home. But the others, they'd done all this work on the song. They wanted to try to complete it. So they tried to, coax him to stay. So John, Paul, and George were all surrounding the microphone. And, Ringo's always been a bit self-conscious about his singing and his voice and his musical ability in general, compared to the three greats. But, he was always popular. Even when they were all at each other's throats, they all individually loved Ringo. So, they stood around the.
He was always the second favorite Beatle for every Beatle fan. Like,
right.
The John fans and the Paul fans, but Ringo was always their second favorite.
He was the Jupiter and third, always popular. So they surrounded the microphone and they encouraged him to stay to record his vocal part. And they kind of stood there for moral support, basically. So he sings a song about with a little help from my friends, while he's getting a little help from his friends, while Venus, perfected Lord of the Year, is in the perfected sign of the year, conjunct his ascendant ruler when it's perfected for the year. And that is the song that he is most known for and still closes every concert with to this day.
Yeah.
This song about with a little help from my friends. So, I mean, I just think that's the most mind-blowing confluence of
literal.
So literal. Yes. So literal.
Well done. Yeah, I totally agree. What do you see when you turn out the light? I can't tell you, but I know it's mine.
So
yeah, no, that's totally. I remember reading that story, and I believe also what was I going to say? I think there might be at least one other song of his that was recorded when Venus was in Taurus as well.
So
not a perfection.
Okay, so the next time he was in that perfection, I believe it was in maybe the next time Venus came around while as a perfected ruler to his Jupiter was around the time of Eric Clapton's wedding in May 1978, and that was one of the only other
79.
times. Or was it 79? Okay, that was one of the only other times that the three Beatles got together. There was almost a reunion. That was one of the few times that they, three of them were together. John would have been there, but he said he never got an invitation or something. But
it was March of '79 in Tucson, Arizona, actually, not far from where you are.
Oh, okay. And I've tracked his perfections throughout the year. So another thing with Ringo as well is, later on, I think it's in 1990 or so, he comes up with his first album with the All-Star Band. And so he basically he basically more or less said his musical philosophy is if you show up and you can play, you're on the album, and it's all about Ringo Starr and his friends, and again, this sort of this third house Jupiter, third house emphasis of close friendships, and then I think the last time he was in,
and for those tours, I mean. I was just going to say, for those tours, he would have all these really great famous musicians from the 70s and 60s, and they each got to sing one or two of their own songs. It really was sort of like a friendship kind of presentation. He's done them for years. I mean, it's basically what his thing has been since then.
Exactly.
Apart from Thomas the Tank Engine.
Always Jupiter, always kind of lighthearted, always kind of
I just came to play me drums.
Right. Unassailably good. Although, and
he's always
he's always sort of jolly.
He's doing the peace.
Always peace and love, love and peace.
We
had to break out our impressions, one point or another. I can't really do George though. Paul, because if you want to do Paul, you're just gonna talk like that, and
if you want to do George, you have to be sort of monosyllabic.
But if you want to be John Lennon, it has to be much higher. It has to be more up here.
Pardon me for asking. Who's the little old man?
Yeah. And
Don't pull that lever. I can't help it. I'm a born lever puller.
yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah, that had to happen at some point. Okay, so we got that.
okay, all right, got that out of the way. The last time that he was in a Jupiter annual profession was just actually maybe like a couple years ago. And the Venus transit through Taurus coincided with when he was finally admitted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Because he had not been for all these years,
Right.
and so he was given this huge, celebration, and Paul McCartney gave this, really nice speech, for Ringo, and so and then he himself gave a big speech, and that was like when Mercury was conjunct as Jupiter in Taurus, so it was another, annually perfected transit, and he receives this, honor, on account of his friends. So it's so I'm pretty convinced that Ringo Starr is, Pisces rising, absolutely, with Jupiter in the third.
I think he's absolutely a Pisces rising.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, that kind of, I can stop sharing that now.
Okay.
So so it's interesting because I kind of have this idea, okay, well, like John Lennon's Marsy, Paul's Mercurial, and George is also kind of Marsy, but in a slightly different way. And then we have Ringo, who's like more like Jupiter. But, but it's weird because each one of them, you've noticed, has kind of some sort of link with a certain planetary cycle. Like, for example, you've noticed that Paul McCartney has a long history with Mars retrogrades, which is interesting because we wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that just from his chart why that might be the case. And even though we've kind of identified Mercury as kind of being descriptive of, his general nature, what he's kind of known for, you, from a cycles perspective, just kind of looking at his chronology, you'd probably say that maybe there's a different way you might kind of describe him in terms of planetary cycles. Would you identify him with Mars, or is Mars just kind of incidental?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I really know the answer to that question. I can only attest that if you look at his life's chronology, there's a way that you can tell the story just using Mars retrogrades. Can I share a slideshow with you?
Absolutely.
All right. Oh, okay. This is something that I've done in some of my workshops. It's not too long here, but here we go.
Oh, wow. Looks cool.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just playing this here. All right, you can see this. Okay, so this is Paul's chart with the
Ringo
Virgo
has
rising,
the same
and you can see the Mars and Leo up there.
Ringo also has Mars.
Ringo has very close to that degree.
Does he have a similar
Paul?
Does Ringo have a similar relationship with the cycle, since he also has Mars conjunct Pluto and Leo?
I would say not as visible. I mean, what's interesting is Paul and Ringo have, if these ascendants are exact, their ascendants are exactly opposite each other.
That's right.
So there's that. That's okay. That's very interesting.
Sorry, I didn't mean
Ringo's,
go ahead.
No, that's quite all right. Ringo's a Venus retrograde guy. Basically, when the way I break them down with the planetary cycles, I see Paul is the Mars guy because the Mars transits, as I'll show you just now, are connect really, really well with his life, not just his musical life, his overall life. Ringo's the Venus guy, and John's a Jupiter guy, and George is a Saturn guy. Although obviously they all get wicked, crazy Saturn transits over the course of their life because they're only human. But here's the thing with Paul. Mars is not angular. It doesn't rule the ascendant. It is in the same sign as the moon, which is interesting in itself. It does get a sextile from Saturn and Uranus, which is interesting enough. But here's the thing. The chronology is kind of mind-blowing. Now, right now, we've got Mars retrograde in Capricorn. It's gone from Aquarius to Capricorn, first time since 1971. When it comes to the signs Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, Mars retrogrades in those signs are very rare and generally only occur once every 32 to 47 years. So this one in Aquarius, for instance, it's the first one in this sign in 47 years. The retrogrades in Capricorn, there was one in 1986, and this one's kind of sort of wandered into Capricorn, so that was 32 years ago. Before 1986, it hadn't happened since 1939, which was 47 years apart, and so on and so forth. So those are really rare retrogrades. And I can make a case, the Mars retrogrades in Virgo that cross Paul's ascendant are really striking, but the ones I want to tell you about are actually the ones that would cross his descendant, and his Pisces descendant, because this is kind of amazing. Mars retrogrades in Pisces happen very infrequently. In the 20th century, you had one in 1909, 1924, and 1956. And that's it. And then we had one in this century in 2003. And then boom, I've just told you about every single time Mars has ever been retrograde in Pisces in the last 100 and whatever years. Okay. Now, with that in mind, let's just look at a couple of things in Paul's life. First of all, his mother, Mary, born September 29th, 1909, she has natally Mars retrograde in Pisces, opposite the sun. Okay. So that's 1909. I don't know what she was doing in 1924. She would have been 15 years old, but that just sort of goes in history in 1924.
So that's on his descendant. That's on his...
That Mars is on his descendant. Yeah, her natal Mars is on his descendant. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me. This is, yeah, right. Now, the next event, like we've already explained this, Neptune was not only making its Neptune ingress in October 1956, Mars was actually just coming out of its retrograde in Pisces. Mary McCartney, in fact, died 21 days after the direct station, but it's still a very slow Mars in Pisces that's just coming out of its retrograde in that really sort of rare spot. And of course, Mary is 47 years old at this point. Now, Mars would not go retrograde in Pisces again until... Oh yeah, this is just a little interlude here. Linda McCartney was born with Mars retrograde in Aries, which is not the same as Pisces, but it's in the same part of the cycle, right? Because sometimes it falls in Pisces. Aries is also quite a rare sign for a Mars retrograde. After 1941, it didn't happen again until 1988, 47 years later. Although there was a brief period in 1973 when it went retrograde from Taurus into Aries, but that is, a smaller part of the cycle. Mm-hmm. But indeed, this still sort of puts Linda McCartney in that same part of the cycle, if not the same sign. This is the exact same retrograde in that phase. And furthermore, when she died of breast cancer, just like Paul's mother died of breast cancer, when Linda died of breast cancer, it was when there was a Sun-Mars conjunction in Aries in April 1998. So there's that as well. But anyway, that's a little interlude. I'm mainly talking about the Mars retrograde in Pisces. So we've seen how Paul's mother was born and died with Mars retrograde in Pisces. And then much later, after Linda died, he remarried and he had a daughter, Beatrice, who was born 31 days after Mars went direct in Pisces. So this is really, this is this elegant thing about the Mars cycle. Whereas the Venus synodic cycle is a symmetrical cycle, the Mars cycle is asymmetrical. Retrogrades happen very frequently in tropical Cancer, Leo, and Virgo every 15 to 17 years in those signs, whereas Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, and to some degree Sagittarius and Aries are still quite rare. The more you're at that end of the zodiac, the more rare it is. The more you're at the other end of the more frequent it is. So it's an asymmetrical cycle, but it's amazing the way you can sort of just pull out these really
distinct.
These are these are really unambiguous things too. There's so much in history that's multivalent, and where you can come up with a bunch of different explanations as to whether it's important or not. Is Love Me Do or Please Please Me the most important first Beatles song or whatever? People can have these sort of silly arguments, but the birth of his mother, the death of his mother, to some degree, as you saw, the birth of his true love and the birth of his youngest child, all falling into this one very little rare fragment of time that occurs very infrequently. That's an amazing sort of use of astrology.
That's great.
Yeah. The Mars retrogrades in Virgo that cross Paul's ascendant. I'll just go back to his chart here for a second. Do I have? Yeah, I don't have charts for them. But basically, when Mars went retrograde in Virgo over his ascendant, one time was in recent memory, or in the memory of the time, during the Beatles years, it was in early 1965, there was a Mars retrograde in Virgo. A few things happened at that time. They were filming the movie Help. And during that period, first of all, he wound up writing Yesterday during that Mars retrograde. He wrote the lyrics. I know your article touched on how when he had the melody kicking around for a long time.
Yeah, he had the dream.
Yeah, he had the dream, and it was the song called "Scrambled Eggs." And he, even like you mentioned in your article, when he wrote the music, but when he finally wrote the lyrics and came and recorded it, which was an important thing because it's the first Beatles song to have just one member of the Beatles on a recording. That was all coming out of the Mars retrograde in Virgo. Another thing that happened during that time was John and George did LSD for the first time, which immediately, that's the beginning of the split. In fact, in many ways, I would say like those two events, Paul recording Yesterday on his own and John and George doing LSD, like if you want like the earliest signs of the Beatles starting to break up, slowly, you can really go to that period between like March and June of 1965. So there's that. And then the next time Mars went retrograde in Virgo was something I've already talked about in 1980 when he was arrested for drugs. Not only was Saturn on his ascendant, but Mars had just gone retrograde.
Right. And that totally makes sense because Mars, basically is about divisions and kind of cutoffs. And so, it makes total sense.
Right. And this is that guy who really fought so hard to not have the Beatles break up. This is the guy who really tried to keep them together. It was obviously like really important to him at one point. The other thing about this Mars cycle, you and I were talking a bit about it before the cameras were rolling, so we should talk to the audience about it while I still have the screen here. So, you know where I'm going with this.
Yes, so 1971.
The last time Mars was actually retrograde in Aquarius was 1971, as I mentioned. And at that point, the Beatles had broken up. But there was one thing that occurred right at that time, was George Harrison's famous concert for Bangladesh, a concert movie that he made at the time. Ringo's in it. And then a lot of people like Eric Clapton and Leon Russell, Bob Dylan. It's a precursor to movies like The Last Waltz and a lot of those other sort of rock and roll music movies with a lot of all-stars. In a way, it's a precursor to the Ringo Starr All-Stars band that we were just talking about. Just getting a bunch of rock stars on stage and having them each take a turn to one of their big numbers. And you can see here that Mars was retrograde in Aquarius. Now, the concert was filmed at Madison Square Garden, August 1st, 1971. George was there. Ringo was there. It was the first big sort of, it's a precursor also to things like Band Aid and Live Aid and all those things, because it was a concert specifically orchestrated to raise money for relief for the country Bangladesh, which was going through a civil war. It would be invaded by Pakistan before the year was over, but they were also having a terrible famine partly because of war and partly because of the climate at the time. So so it was a benefit concert. It was an all-star concert, and John and Paul were both invited and both very nearly participated in the concert. John was actually in New York City with Yoko at this point. But decided not to attend the concert because George didn't want Yoko on stage. So there's Yoko, if not breaking up the Beatles, at least breaking up the concert for Bangladesh. And Paul was suing the Beatles at the time. So he just, he wanted to do it. Like he liked the idea of doing it. And it would have been cool. Like even George, who was really, the most ambivalent Beatle, as we've said, I think like for the cause, he totally would have been willing to have Ringo, John, and Paul on stage with him and, do some old Beatle numbers. People would have just gone ballistic. And it's one of those moments that were like, it almost, what could have been, it almost happened. Yeah.
but Neptune, this is the entrance of Neptune to Sagittarius. It's kind of the new era, the new
Yeah.
post-Beatles era for each of them. The
Yes.
Scorpio period had kind of passed, and so the 60s period had kind of ended, and then Neptune in Sagittarius kind of gave us like disco and funk, and those are kind of because I would think that like the reason why it would make sense.
And we mustn't forget that we can't forget the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton
Right.
pretending to be
Yeah.
the Bees.
So and also that's also the beginning of glam rock. David Bowie and stuff. So the Sagittarian kind of out there kind of music. So I mean,
I think also, I was going to say the other thing that came about in 1969, just as the Beatles were recording Abbey Road, their last album, at that same time, a new kind of Beatles came out. They weren't musical, they were comedic. You got Monty Python. And George Harrison himself kind of said that the Monty Python guys kind of took over where the Beatles left off more than any sort of musical group.
That's really funny.
Intermingling between these guys.
That's really funny you mentioned that too, because I think if we can go off for a brief Monty Python detour, I think it's John Cleese. Yeah, he has an A-rated chart. John Cleese, I believe, he was born with Virgo rising.
For all those guys.
Yeah, John Cleese was born with Virgo rising, and he has Mercury in Scorpio in the third. And so I think it's interesting because, again, with the Beatles, when we saw members who had the ruler of their ascendant in the third house, it had to do with the band they were in,
Yeah.
So in one case it was the Beatles, but with John Cleese it was, this comedy troupe. So, if anyone has the ruler of the first and the third, this is something to think about as far as like, what the focus of their life is probably to do with the friends they have, lead them
the
on
gang they hang out.
The gang they have, the troupe they have, the band they have. Anyway, so I just remember I've kind of struggled with the third house sometimes because I'm like, the third house has these kind of like boring significations in some ways. It's not as sort of sexy or dynamic as some of the other house combinations. So it's like the third house. What's in the third house? Well, this is the kind of thing.
It's the joy of the moon. It's the joy of the moon, which I think is another reason that it has that sort of gang thing, because you go, it's where you get that lunar comfort, the safety in numbers.
Exactly. Exactly.
Elvis Presley always envied the Beatles for that reason. Like, with you guys, there's 4 of you. You get to share all the burden and go through it together. Whereas,
now we get the Elvis impression. Well, might as well.
Yeah. Well, your hair's.
Might as well do my David Bowie soon.
We'll get through them all.
But what was I gonna say? So Neptune, like, why do you think Neptune? Why do you think it's Neptune that is the planet that is kind of the through thread? I mean, we know like it was on, Paul's ascendant. We know that it was on Ringo's descendant. We know that it kind of figured in with the charts in different ways. But why the planet Neptune? What is it about the planet Neptune, do you think? I mean, I have an idea, but I'm just wondering what.
Yeah, I think there's a few things in there. There's a lot of, first of all, the Beatles are from Liverpool. And I've always found it very interesting, if you know your World War II history, like the city of Liverpool and the city of Hamburg and what went on between those two cities, because they were the respective British and German cities where the submarines would launch from, and where, all the sort of naval warfare involved in the Second World War, all the submarine stuff and the ship stuff came out of those two cities. Yeah. And so, and it was right. The fact that the Beatles, these kids from Liverpool, let's face it, it was when they went to Hamburg that they got their musical act together, they got their image together, and they really became this slick. They were really created there. In fact, that they adopted the name the Beatles, shortened from the Silver Beatles, specifically because they were going to Hamburg, and it sort of made more sense to have a short, catchy name when you're in a country that speaks a different language.
Right.
So yeah, they go to the Beatles. They become the Beatles in August of 1960, right when they go to England, to Germany rather, to Hamburg, and they're transformed. And I think that's, these two sort of sea cities, really they're cities that exist for navies to exist, kind of thing. Well, there's more to Hamburg than that, but it really is the only port that Germany has. So I think there's something that just like right from there, like where they're from, there's
something.
Neptune.
There's something very poetic about that. Considering that the World War II had only ceased, in 45. That these two countries had been at war, and then
they were both. The band was born during the war.
Right, the band was born during the war, so yeah, it was like it was almost like the beginning of kind of healing the division in some way, between the two countries. So sort of had some sort of strange connection there.
Exactly.
One idea I had about, I don't know, I guess like why Neptune signifies like these kinds of things is, Neptune has these associations with, I guess, people say fantasy, idealism. I feel like it kind of has to do with the sort of collective kind of, I'm trying to figure out a way to say without sounding like a total idiot. Collective idealisms, like when we think of especially like the modern music industry, we think of the way in which people Neptune's supposed to be like about like conformity, and so like music is where we've made a recording, something instead of an artificial reproduction of sound, and everyone's listening to the exact same thing. No matter where they are, sort of independent of their location. Instead of, I feel like that's why, when Neptune goes through the signs, that, usually seems to bookend these periods of what people are kind of tuned into, like the kind of collective drug, as it were. The zeitgeist, the drug that, we're kind of all open to. And so that's why you kind of see, there's trends reflected across music and cinema. What I think is interesting with Neptune Scorpio is, a lot of people call that, period from the like late 50s through to about 1970, like the angry young man period of cinema. That this is period of cinema, British cinema, where you have these sort of angry young men, these sort of black and white films, these sort of stark working class dramas, where there's a lot more sort of graphic violence or sort of gritty. So it's funny because it kind of reminds me of, in some ways, it sort of reminds me of it's sort of a parallel to the, the early images of the Beatles. They are also these sort of brash young lads from this kind of hard Scrabble place, who end up, really kind of becoming something.
There's also, there's a lot of, you're right, like Neptune has a collectivist flavor to it. And the Neptune and Scorpio years aren't just the Beatle years, they're sort of the rock and roll years.
Right.
If you go
Jimi Hendrix as well. Sort of been that.
Yeah, well, if you're going from Elvis in 1956, which is the year that he really sort of breaks into the zeitgeist, go from Elvis through the Beatles to the end of the 60s, you've got Neptune and Scorpio, and there is something collectivist about this. The other thing, the really obvious thing is the Beatles are a British band, and the pinnacle of their career is breaking America, breaking into the States, and there's a lot of, Neptune is it's the planet of sort of colonialism of the 19th century. When the Beatles grow mustaches for Sgt. Pepper, what is it for a British guy wearing a mustache? What does that mean? Well, the first British guys to wear mustaches were British guys who wound up in India during the Raj years, because Indians wore mustaches, and the whole idea of mustaches becoming a big thing in the 19th century were these British guys imitating, the Indian men that they had seen.
Right.
And so when the Beatles are wearing even just like the mustache in Western culture, and the way the Beatles sort of reintroduced, no one had a mustache between 1890 something and 1967, suddenly they became thing again.
Well, and they call it the British invasion. You know, that.
Yes, the British invasion. Yeah, I mean, they crossed the ocean to sort of have this the success they did.
Mhm.
And I think you're absolutely right. Neptune is recorded music and the medium
Yeah, the media,
itself, and
the
the
right.
the things that yeah the things that they introduced into recorded music being on the equivalent of a 4-track machine, or the sound effects that they invented because they had George Martin to work with. There's so many things, like any guitar player that who has an electric guitar, they'll have effects pedals, and some of them have names like flanger, and flanger is literally a word invented by John Lennon as an instruction to a recording engineer in terms of how he wanted his voice, the effect on his voice to sound. So there's all this stuff that they did. There's all this, what they just introduced to the technique of recording music. I think signifies them with Neptune. My laptop battery is about to die.
Oh no. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Well, that's
we're having such a great time.
I know, but all good things must come to an end. All things must pass.
Yes.
So,
just let it be, Watson.
Let it.
Maybe we.
Oh my God. All right.
Maybe we do a part 2 sometime, because I think there's always more we could say, but we sure covered a lot anyway, and we went on quite a while.
Yeah. So this was a great. This might be a good place to end today's episode, but I'll definitely have you back. It might not necessarily be to talk about the Beatles, but we could just do this forever. So
Yes.
so if you're watching this, thank you for giving to my Patreon, because you guys are the only ones who are actually able to watch this, at least for right now. So thank you for your support. And if you want to find out more about Nick Dagan Best's work, you can visit it at, what's your email address? What's your website right now?
I have a website. URL that's my name, nickdaganbest.com. I'm in the midst of transforming it right now, so there's not a whole lot to see for the time being. But
under construction.
I've got a big launch forthcoming. Yeah, for the time being, I'm laying quite low, but I'm very, very busy preparing something large scale, almost as big as the Beatles. I'm going to do something that'll be more popular than the Beatles were when they said they were more popular than Jesus Christ.
I was just about to say that. All right, you took away my joke.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me, Nick.
Or as John Lennon would say, you read my file.
Right. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Nick. It's always a pleasure talking to you about astrology.
Likewise, Watson.
I can't wait to do it again. All right. I'll see all of you next time. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.